Hi there, everyone. My name is Max Young, and I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of Vroman's Bookstore to tonight's virtual event. We're so lucky that you're able to join us and that we're able to continue bringing you authors and their books during this time. Tonight, we have with us Diana Peterson-More, who will be in conversation with Julie Winkle Giulioni, discussing Diana's book, Consequential Communication in Turbulent Times, A Practical Guide to Leadership. Tonight's event includes a Q&A portion, so if you would like to ask Diana a question at any point, you can go ahead and click the Ask a Question button towards the bottom, and they'll get to that towards the end of the event. And then if you would like to purchase Diana's book, you can go ahead and click the green button down there, and it takes you right to our website. But with that all out of the way, I will go ahead and introduce our guest for tonight. First off, we have with us Diana Peterson-More, who is a former practicing employment lawyer, corporate officer, and HR director. She founded her own consulting firm, the Organizational Effectiveness Group, and is a sought-after conference speaker and consultant. Herself a manager and hundreds of individuals over a 15-year corporate career, Diana often states, "I made a lot of mistakes as a manager. The good news is that I learned from those mistakes. The better news is that I'm willing to share those mistakes with you, so you won't make those mistakes." I love that. That's great. And with her is Julie Winkle Giulioni, who helps organizations enhance learning, engagement, retention, and the bottom line. Her consulting firm, Design Around, specializes in enterprise-wide learning experiences and custom training. Julie is a regular contributor to The Economist, The Conference Board, Training Industry Magazine, TD, Smart Brief, and other publications. But with that all out of the way, I will go ahead and let them both take over. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Max. And I am so excited. I'm Julie, and this is my friend Diana. And I am so honored to spend this evening talking with Diana about her book, Consequential Communication in Turbulent Times. So Diana and I have been friends for longer than I'm willing to admit. Our kids kind of grew up together. And I met her first when she was the executive vice president at Times Mirror. And at the time, she had a huge portfolio of responsibilities. And since that time, she's been out on her own. And Diana, you are expert in so many things. I mean, you work with organizations around strategic planning and team building. You do diversity and inclusion work, harassment. I mean, you could have written a book on hundreds of different topics. And so I wonder, why and how did you choose this particular topic for your first book?
Well, my goal was to be able to share what I've learned over these many years. And it just turns out that communication and miscommunication more frequently tend to be at the heart of all workplace matters. And so over the years, I've compiled a lot of lessons learned. Some are my own, some are having worked with others. And I thought, what a great idea to put the compilation into a book form. And it's really a story form. People who know me and follow my career can figure out which stories are about me, and there are some in there about me, and which stories impact other people, but hopefully they resonate with folks. Yeah. However, before I launched the book, I didn't realize that there's a gazillion and 3 books on communication. And I just feel very fortunate, perhaps because mine is not intensely research-based, but really based upon my own experiences, that it does resonate with people.
Yeah. So you mentioned workplace miscommunication. And in your consulting practice and in your corporate life before, I would imagine you've come across quite a bit of that. Just wonder, would you talk a little bit about sort of the cost, the problems that we have as a result of poor communication in the workplace?
Okay, Julie, so you got me there after just having explained that my book is not research-based. There is a lot of research out there that speaks to miscommunication and conflict. And there are 3 that really sing to my soul. One is about conflict and the other 2 are about communication. So the CEO of AHA, and I love that name, corporation, recently wrote an article in Inc. magazine. He cited somebody else's research, but he basically came up with this figure of $365 billion a year was lost due to conflict And based upon the number of people surveyed, that translated into 2.8 hours a week, or essentially 3 hours a week. And if you 3 hours a week times 50 weeks is 150 divided by 40 hours in a week, you're talking about, a good chunk of people's time is spent trying to resolve or manage conflicts. On the communication front, Quantum Communication did a survey, and they just spoke to organizations with 100,000 employees or more, and they found, again, millions of dollars lost due to miscommunication. And all of this impacts productivity and the bottom line. But to me, it's really about maximizing your people power. And the one that really sang to me, probably because it's about stories, a woman in 2013, Kelly Dickerson was her name, wrote about 8 fatal, tragic accidents that were all a result of miscommunication, 2 of which were plane crashes. One was in Tenerife, if anybody remembers that. Now I'm really dating myself. And the other was in South Korea. And the one in South Korea was very compelling because the junior officers on the flight knew there was a problem, but because of the prohibition on kind of contradicting one's superior, they didn't. And they went down and everybody died. And another really sad one, I say as a parent, was a miscommunication between and among a physician, a pharmacist, and a mother. And she inappropriately gave cough medicine to a child who ended up brain damage. So you kind of think about the cost, human cost, but also workplace cost. And it's to me, it's all about happy employees are motivated employees, and motivated employees are productive employees. So it really does impact the bottom line.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And you were talking about conflict. I mean, did you say 3 hours a week we spend kind of unraveling conflict?
Yeah.
Oh,
And to me, most conflict, at the root of most conflict is a miscommunication. And I'm a big one for using I statements and accepting responsibility. There's a lot of you. And when there's a lot of you in the workplace, people tend to get defensive. So I kind of reframe, instead of saying you hurt my feelings, I would own it and say my feelings were hurt when this was said. And the point is made, and it's also more likely to get a response. And then I also think right now, and I've done a little bit of reading about it and written a couple of blogs about the good old lizard brain, the limbic reaction, which is the fight or flight mechanism. And we tend to immediately defend ourselves, and we tend to immediately say something that in reflection we probably wish we hadn't said, but it just leads to conflict in the workplace and loss of productivity, angry feelings, and even violence.
So the lizard brain contributes part of this. Mm-hmm. What else is making workplace conflict so prevalent today?
Well, when I wrote the book, when I put, pen to paper, as it were, which was really fingertips to the ye old PC, it was at a time when there was a lot of social upheaval, a lot of cultural upheaval, a lot of political upheaval. And I think a lot of it has had to do with the change in the workplace, the change demographically, both in countries, migration, and fear of other. I think when everybody's around people with whom they feel really comfortable and confident, everything seems to be okay. When we start introducing others in, there tends to be kind of this stand back, shall we say. So I think that's part of it. And then, frankly, we've had a very volatile political period for the last 4 years when we've had somebody who was kind of bucking the norms, and that was very uncomfortable for people, and saying things that formerly were not acceptable in the public square, as it were. And then all of a sudden 2020 happened, and we have this pandemic. And once again, people are having to adjust to being in unfamiliar situations. And sadly, a lot of people, when they get outside their comfort zone, they tend to use words as swords. They tend to kind of respond first, think second. I remember one of the many sage pieces of advice I received was to take the 15-second pause before responding that then became in the cool of the evening. And I incorporated that into my own life to the extent that I could. And rather than respond right away, really think about, strategically, what's the purpose of this comment? What do I want to achieve? And how do I do it? Typically, you're looking for a response in somebody else. And when you're attacking them, they're not very likely to respond the way you want them to.
Yeah. So immediacy it can definitely be a problem. And it strikes me, we've got social media and email that really feed into our ability to send something off thoughtlessly. Of course, now we've got virtual communication. Many of us are living on Zoom these days. How is all of that affecting an individual's ability to navigate, these turbulent times?
Great question. And like everybody else, I've become addicted to Zoom and do a lot of Zoom meetings. There's a lot of efficiency involved with that as well. But even starting with email way back when, I worked for a very progressive company that had email early on. And I'll never forget one day sitting in my office and somebody flying by. And she said, "Oh my God, I just sent an email to so-and-so." And she was trying to get into that person's office to erase the email. So I think what happens is that people are sitting by themselves and they kind of feel safe and anonymous and they want to get something off their chest. And sadly with emails, and there's been a lot of situations, emails don't go away. They create a record. And I've been involved in investigations where things were found on emails and people have been terminated and hurt feelings abound. But I think it's really, in the good old days or the bad old days, we were kind of instructed, and this was, pre the advent of so much technology, that never say anything in writing that you wouldn't want to appear on the front page of the LA Times. Well, I mean, I'm really dating myself with that one, but I don't think people, think about the implications. They don't put themselves in somebody else's shoes. They just kind of get it off their chest, and then it's out there in cyberspace. And boy, it comes back to haunt people. And it's also pretty destructive. And I would say, and I'm a Twitter user, I use LinkedIn and Twitter. I'm shocked at some of the language. I mean, it's not to say I don't drop F-bombs in the privacy of my own home and so forth, but in the public square, the kind of lack of civility that's going on right now, to me, it's like we've taken sides and we're not listening to one another.
Yeah. Can we talk for a minute about virtual communication? Because back in March, the world turned upside down. And although there was a lot of virtual communication before then, I mean, it's just grown exponentially. What are some of the challenges associated with communicating through technology versus face-to-face?
Well, it's interesting. I think there's a lot that's been written. I actually wrote a couple of blogs about it. I think there needs to be, and probably will be over time, some standard rules to the road or some etiquette. I've been in Zoom conversations where people talk over one another. I mean, I've been in other Zoom conversations where people establish ground rules and they might, raise their hand to be acknowledged by whomever is kind of facilitating the conversation. And I think also it can be very distracting. Now, I say that, and I'm sitting in what's now my office with ivy painted up on the top of the walls, which could be very distracting. But I've noticed that sometimes people will have lights blaring in the background, or they'll have music on, or they'll pick up their instrument and they'll walk through their house with it, which personally I find a little bit disorienting. So I think there's been both a content issue that has to do with who participates and how do they participate and what are the ground rules. And then there's also just the technological aspect of it. If I'm going to get up and leave, I always put my camera on picture or something like that, or I try to mute it. And I believe that people are well-meaning and good intentions. So I don't think anyone's trying to be obnoxious, but they just aren't really thinking about it. So I think there's both the content piece, how do you make sure everyone has a voice and every voice is heard, and then there's also kind of just the practical application of it. how do you maneuver with in a way that's comfortable for everybody.
Yeah, the technical part of it can definitely get clunky.
Yeah.
So I had the pleasure of witnessing behind the scenes some of the work that you were doing to write this book. And you had more than a couple of glasses of wine. And I remember that there were several times where you wished that you had been able to get this book out more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, it's funny how things work out, isn't it? Because your book was published in February, and then the world turned upside down. The pandemic was in full bloom in March. And it really made that expression, turbulent times. Thinking about it, that's pretty prescient. And I'm just curious, and to be honest, all the more appropriate today. So I'm curious, what made you choose that expression at that point?
I think at that point in time, it really had to do with what was going on politically in our country to a greater or lesser extent. I've just witnessed the workplace change. And I think there's probably, 4 or 5 different reasons. One is diversity. I have worked, I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I've always lived and worked in very diverse environments. And so I say this, that I've noticed that it's not exclusive to whites, because I've worked in a Latino environment where everyone's Latino. I've done work at an agency where half the group was Chinese and half the group was Latino. So there's a sense of wanting to hang out with the people you feel comfortable with. And so it's very challenging to open up your world to other people. So I think that's part of it. I also think that the workplace compact has changed. It used to be in the oldie moldy days that if you kept your nose clean and did what the boss said, whether you believed it or not, you too could retire with a defined benefit retirement plan and retiree health care. Well, that's gone by the wayside. So employees are now saying, what's in it for me? I also think generationally, we have 4 generations in the workplace. We still have a few veterans, but we have Gen Xers, we have baby boomers, we have Gen Xers, we have Zeners, we have millennials, we have the next generation. And each generation brings its own set of expectations, its own language. There was an interesting dialogue about that the other day, about how the word socialism, I was having this with some people who were on this, listening to our participation. It had to do with a book that talked about how millennials view the word socialism very differently than maybe baby boomers do in general. And it's just very interesting trying to bring everybody together in the workplace. And the goal should really be, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. What do we have in common? What are we focused on? And what can we all do to get there? So I just think there's been a lot of social and political upheaval. I think the pandemic just exacerbated it. And it's been, it wasn't necessarily prescient. I think, if anything, maybe all the other turmoil we were going through prepared us for what happened this year. Because really, between the pandemic and then a very contentious presidential election, which for some people doesn't seem to be over yet, was very anxiety producing for people. And as a result, that lizard brain, that limbic response, I just heard things out of people's mouths that I know they wouldn't have said in kinder, gentler times.
Yeah. These are indeed turbulent times.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about who you wrote this book for. When you were sitting down and putting fingers to keyboard, what kinds of faces and needs came up in your mind?
Well, I was really, because most of them are about my experiences, and Max said it. I always say when I start out a coaching or a facilitating assignment, I'll say, look, I made a lot of mistakes as a first-time manager, and after that, by the way. The good news is I learned from those mistakes. The better news is I'm willing to share those mistakes with you so you won't make them. And I have a lot of empathy. for people in the workplace who are frontline supervisors and managers, because like most people, how do you get promoted? You get promoted because you're a great individual contributor. And then all of a sudden you're expected to just automatically have this whole different skill set. How do you motivate? How do you delegate? How do you get the most and best out of yourself and others? How do you move through an environment to success? So it was really, I think people who are emerging leaders, although I will say my book has been used by somebody, Ken Gosnell is his name, who did something called who has the CEO experience in the CEO magazine, and he used it as the basis for a CEO leadership retreat, essentially. So I think, and then I started thinking about it, why is that? Well, the reason that is because as you rise in an organization, you don't necessarily realize that you're imperfect and you're making mistakes, and nobody wants to tell you that. So it's so in the workplace, it was really written for the workplace. However, all of us communicate 24/7. So I think there's a lot of lessons that can be applied in one's regular life as well.
Yeah, I agree. And as I read the book, it really struck me that it's appropriate for everyone, whether you're an individual contributor, bringing your expertise to the job, or in leadership, or, as you mentioned, at the executive level. Honing one's communication skills is it's a key competency.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a little bit of a digression. However, what's interesting to me is the whole notion of comparable worth started out not as men being paid more than women, but it started out at JPL, actually. And the notion was, how come we're paying the administrators who have a whole bunch of people reporting to them more than a scientist or an engineer who took us to the moon? So this notion was we were going to value the job and the contribution to the organization. Well, that has kind of fallen by the wayside. And once again, how do people succeed in organizations? By moving up. How do you move up? By having the breadth and depth of people who report to you. And not everybody's A, likes to manage, and B, has the skill sets or the tools to do it. And yet, how many people voluntarily step back because they view that as a loss of status, power, money, whatever. And so I have a lot of empathy because the first time I was promoted, I was a practicing employment lawyer. And I happened to have been at Southern California Edison Company. I was recruited in-house. And I was the first female and the first lawyer promoted out of the department, and the first individual. I was asked to manage an HR function. All of a sudden, I had 50 people reporting to me, the vast majority of whom were older than I was. And I really hated it for the first 2 or 3 months, but all eyes were on me. And I thought, Diana, if you go back with your tail between your legs, you will have, put the kibosh on lawyers moving out of the law department and on females moving up in the organization. So I set myself a year, and I thought, okay, it would be respectable if I wanted to move away after a year. But in that year, I really forced myself to apply both legal principles, but also principles of being a mother at the time. I had 2 small children, and I thought, now what do? We have our kids in a sandbox. We encourage them to stay in. They go out. We encourage them to stay in. They go out. There are consequences. So it took me a while. And by the end of that year, I wasn't a great manager, but I was beginning to understand what I needed to do. And I stayed. And the rest, as they say, is history. But having gone through that, I have a lot of empathy for people and the struggles that they endure.
Yeah. And what about communication during that time? What lessons did you learn in terms of communicating during that rough year?
Well, I think some of them are in the book, not all of them. But this whole notion of listening, asking, and telling. I mean, bosses in general do too much telling and not enough listening and asking. The principle of using I statements. I think it's so important to accept responsibility for communication. It's so important to own it and to not put it off on somebody else. So I think those are kind of the 2 founding principles. And then over time, it really grew. I also think that the power of apology It's not if we make a mistake, it's how we handle it. And all of us make mistakes. And I think it's so important to own it and to apologize and to move on. And so probably those, but a lot of them were based on experiences I had over time.
Yeah, yeah. So let's spend a moment on the apology, because I'm probably not the only one on this call who struggles with that. And as you said, it's so powerful to be able to apologize and apologize well. What are your thoughts, your tips, your guidance around doing it well?
Well, I think a lot of it stems from miscommunication. And I think it's really important. There's another chapter called Assuming Facts Not in Evidence, which is something as a lawyer you learn. And we all do that to a greater or lesser extent. We all have a base of knowledge, and we sort of assume that other people share that base of knowledge. And so we may say something, do something, communicate, because communication comes in many forms. It can be body language, it can be, facial expressions, it can be what you wear, how you present yourself, what you say, that scowl on your face, whether your arms are, crossed over your chest. I think that we have a tendency to assume that other people know what we want. They don't necessarily know what we want. And so the classic is, I've delegated an assignment to Julie. I haven't been clear in the communication. Julie really wants to please me, so she goes off and does what she thinks I want. And instead of my saying, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't communicate clearly, this is what I was looking for, most bosses will say, Julie, why did you give me this? I was looking for whatever. And it doesn't really, and so part of it is, I guess to me, it's being strategic. I'm communicating with Julie about an assignment. What's the goal? The goal is to get Julie to deliver what I want. How am I going to make that happen? Well, I'm going to communicate in different modes and methods. One of the things that I developed over time is that there's the communication following the golden rule, which is I will communicate with Julie the way Diana likes to be communicated with, whereas I should be communicating with Julie with the platinum rule, communicating with Julie the way she wants to be communicated with. And we don't always know that. So I think, you kind of try different methods and modes. So I might have a conversation with Julie and then say, Julie, I'm not 100% sure that I communicated clearly. Can you go send me an email and repeat what I've asked you to do? And even if I think I was clear as a bell, and I was very clear about 4 things I wanted, and Julie sends me back 3, then my response, instead of saying, you didn't get the 4th one, I'd say, I'm sorry, I wasn't very clear. You're spot on those 3. The 4th thing I'd like you to do is X, Y, and Z. And it's kind of owning responsibility. So I believe in communication. It's not your job to understand me. It's my job to make sure I'm understood. And that really flips it. Most of the time, we expect other people to understand us. And I think if you operate on that principle, it's my job to make sure I'm understood, then I will do, I'll communicate with you in writing. I'll communicate with you verbally. I'll ask for you to repeat back to me. A lot of supervisors don't like to do that because they feel like they're offending people. They're not. Trust me, they're not. So I just think, so along the way, apologies happen because I didn't communicate clearly. I'm sorry, Julie, I didn't communicate clearly. Let's try it this way. Or just flat out, I made a bad decision. I'm sorry. I made a bad decision. I did my best. Sorry, we're going to have to live with it. There's just different ways of handling it, but it's about accepting responsibility and ownership. And then I think the other piece of it is, and I'm working with somebody right now, when somebody does something, thank them. When somebody does a good job, tell them they've done a good job. I'm working with somebody right now who basically says, my expectation is you will always do a good job and you'll only hear from me when you screw up. Well, who likes that? Nobody. So I'm sure I kind of jumbled a lot of different concepts there, but they all kind of run together in my mind at some point. Sorry.
No, it was great. You're getting lots of good feedback in chat. Love the distinction in the communication. This is so pertinent to any relationship, so outside of the workplace. And I really love what you were just talking about saying thank you and recognizing people. I mean, that is such an important communication context. And it's one that's frequently forgotten. It's, sort of, if everything is working, it just doesn't occur to you.
One of the chapters in the book, it says Simon SVP, but this person's name wasn't Simon. This person was an SVP at a huge entertainment company. And I always do a 360 performance evaluation before I coach somebody. And for those who are not familiar, 360 is literally a circle. So you're at the center of the circle. You assess yourself. Your boss assesses you. Your peers assess you, and your subordinates. That makes the circle. And I use an open-ended questionnaire. One of the questions is, I get feedback. And invariably what I hear is, I always know when I screw up. I never know when I do well. And so I'm pretty practical. I'm pretty common sense. And so what I said to this individual, Simon, his name is changed to protect the innocent, is, don't be phony and don't be fake, because anyone can smell a rat a mile away. But surely in the course of a week, there will be someone who will have done something nice for you and say thank you. And there will be someone who will have done a good job and give them an attaboy or an attagirl. And so Simon started doing this. Well, within 3 months, people were dying to come work for him because they knew that they would be recognized. And fast forward, Simon is now, and subsequently he's gone to a couple of different companies. He's in another entertainment company now. I was just contacted by them to give 360s to the senior leadership team. And I said, well, I only give 360s if I can really debrief and get information and give you acts and facts to work with. I don't just give a 360 and give you the results, because that can be fairly devastating. But it just is an example to me of how you can take a situation, give a very practical, easy to implement solution that turns one's life around, essentially, workplace life. I know that's kind of dramatic, but it really did change things for this individual, and it changed him. So rather than looking for people to screw up, he was looking for people to do the right thing.
Oh my gosh, that's total 180 shift in terms of his mindset. I'm sure he's a more pleasant person at home as well.
Yeah.
And Liz was just saying it's so important to feel valued, and agree with the importance of saying thank you. Judy mentioned also the importance of please. Simple things that our parents probably taught us, and somewhere along the way we kind of lose that thread a little bit. That's great.
I think about it a lot. I've always been fascinated by what motivates people in the workplace and so forth. But I don't, it's kind of ego and kind of power in a way. And, one of the things that I'm shifting to is just having gone through the pandemic, which we're still going through, and an election we were still going through, is that a lot of the I has now become very ego. I mean, you see it on Twitter, LinkedIn, you hear it on the news. Well, I predicted this was going to happen, and I said this, and and it's kind of like I, me. So to me, that's a misuse of I. It's not about accepting responsibility. It's about being a little bit of a blowhard. And sadly, I think in organizations, people somehow, I don't know if it's how necessarily that, but they believe that that when they have a certain power position, they can be demanding without giving recognition, without being polite, without being nice, without being respectful.
Yeah. I want to go back to your discussion of ego in just a minute, but I want to remind everybody who's listening that Diana would love to answer your questions as well as mine. So feel free to note them in the Ask a Question pod, or also you can do it in chat. We'll keep an eye on that as well. So back to ego. You have a chapter in the book that's dedicated to humility. Would you talk a couple minutes about that?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that happens, again, and this is this whole notion of you were a great individual contributor, so you were elevated. And this really comes from somebody you probably knew, Julie. It was somebody at Times Mirror, actually. And it was a person in a department. And I have to say where it was. It was the audit department. And this person had come from outside, from one of the big auditing firms. And I facilitated a couple of retreats for him. And in one of them, he was just talking about how good it felt to be in an environment where he wasn't around all these, white shirts and stiff collars, and people were really people and were really nice. And it was like dead silence in the room. And so we kind of went around the room, and he had to buck up a little bit to listen to it. And people were very candid. And one of the ground rules was you could be candid. And it was kind of like, the Las Vegas rule, what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. Well, I've changed cities, and I say the Reno rule, which means what happens here stays here. However, the lessons you learn, you cannot attribute to anybody, but you can use them outside. So practicing the Reno rule, people went around and they started saying, well, you always, you ask our opinion, but then you always use your idea anyway. And this person was just crestfallen. And here he thought he was having this great dialogue with people and tossing around ideas. So we came up with a ground rule. And the ground rule was, if he really didn't know, he could say, guys, I really don't know how I want to move forward. This is the end result. I'm taking all good ideas. If he was 50% of the way there, he'd say, pretty much I'm thinking that we should do this, but I'm open to other ideas. If he was 99.9% of the way there saying, we're going to do this unless you can see me walking into a buzzsaw, and people then could calibrate what they were going to do. And it saved him because he could still have these dialogues with people, but he was giving them the ground rule that was associated with it. That was a very humbling experience for him. And I've also found, we adopted another rule that he was the last to speak, which is a great rule in a group, because guess what? Your excellent idea might be raised by somebody else, so they get credit for it and feel good about it. Or somebody else might have a better idea than yours. So I think there's certain ways where leaders can be humble. They can still lead, but they can follow as well. So those are kind of the lessons that come to mind for me. And it's really about the old listening, asking, and telling. Bosses, in my mind, do too much telling and not enough listening and asking. And, when I was corporate secretary at Southern California Edison Company, which was my last position there, we had a shareholder services department, and it was kind of routine and kind of rote. And I put in self-managed work teams. And way back when there was a commercial, again, I'm dating myself, where are you going for lunch? Same place, same time. I mean, people were very robotic in those days. And so I started letting them solve problems. And they started solving problems that I was aware of. But then they started coming forward with problems I wasn't aware of and solving them. And it just kind of opened them up to the possibility of their contribution. And by my allowing them to lead, we were a much better department.
That's great. Well, let me ask, we have a couple of questions from
Sure.
the audience, Diana.
Yes.
Anne wants to know, in general, do you think organizations sufficiently value strong communication skills in the hiring and advancing of key executives?
Boy, that's a great question, Anne. And I think the answer is no. I think that people, sadly, still spend too little time hiring because they don't like to do it. They find it annoying. And that if they put the time in up front, they wouldn't have to spend so much time disciplining and maybe terminating someone down the road. I mean, I'm a real advocate of skill-based hiring, which takes time, and it's a dialogue, and it's predicated on the notion that past performance is the best predictor of future performance. So instead of saying, Julie, how would you handle an irate customer? I would say, Julie, tell me about an irate customer situation in the last 6 months. You could have been the customer, you could have been the person providing the customer service. And you learn a lot about people that way. I think there's just too little time spent up front doing that. And to Anne's question, to me, the so-called soft skills are the hard skills of the 21st century. How do you communicate? How do you motivate? How do you lead? How do you get the most and best out of others, which were, kind of, second fly on my lapel, secondary skill sets to knowledge base. I think we have changed a lot, and I think it's critical we continue changing because millennials and Gen Xers don't want to be treated poorly. They want to be shown respect and they want to have a voice. And if they do not have it, they'll go someplace else. So some of your best assets will walk out the door.
Well, that's probably true of folks outside of the Gen X and
oh yeah,
entrance to the workforce.
Yeah,
Folks are expecting to be treated with dignity and respect as well.
Mm-hmm. Although I will say, we baby boomers, of which I am one, we tend to be conditioned to that environment of where the boss used to say, I say jump, you say how high. Now, not all of us, you and I happen to have left that environment and are consultants, mostly in large measure, probably because we were not wanting to be in that kind of environment. But it's particularly true of younger workers who don't feel the same. They're being asked for loyalty, but they're not being shown loyalty and respect. And loyalty means something different. It could mean more vacation. It could be more respect for the work-life balance. I mean, you and I were working mothers, and there was, very little accommodation for that. I think there's not enough today, but there's more so than there was, and it's being demanded, which in my mind is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question from Mary. Books seem so applicable to personal relationship dynamics. Many times what we do at home, we also bring to work. Any pointers in communication to gently and with good intent on how to gift the book to family and friends?
That's so sweet. I think one of the things you could do very easily is say, oh, a good friend of mine wrote this book. I'd like, what do you think? As opposed to saying, I think you need to read this book, because that would probably be a turnoff. Or, gee, I just picked this up the other day. A friend of mine wrote it, asked me to read it, and I found some value. What do you think? I actually have had some clients, and I know you do this as well, because Julie is also an author and was my kind of kick in the rear end to get my book out. I know that I have clients now who are purchasing books in quantity and giving them to their employees. So, but I would handle it gently. I have family members who haven't read my book, and it's hard to practice what you preach. Although, Julie, you and I have had this conversation before. Your husband is also a facilitator, and you once told me that you guys would have a discussion and you'd both be facilitating each other. Well, I've had conversations with my children when one of them will say, oh, Mom, that's just right out of your book. So,
yeah. I've heard the same thing. Okay, Karen is asking, do you have any advice that you give to employees for dealing with a boss that's a bully? When there are differences at play, or a boss who's a bit thin-skinned?
It's really funny because I always say I like to deal with acts and facts, not conclusions, opinions, or attribution of motivation. So I'm not 100% sure by what Karen means, but the thin skin one, meaning someone, I think bosses need to get positive feedback too. And I think depending upon the nature of the thin skin, if it's someone who's maybe feeling insecure or whatever, would be to start out with own the conversation. I'm not sure I understood what's being asked. Can I repeat to you what I think you want me to do? And that can kind of dispel some of the, aggressive or bullying behavior. But also, I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity. And I want to make sure I deliver what it is that you're wanting me to do. Can I repeat to you what it is? I think it's kind of flipping the lessons. In other words, the lessons that I might ask of a supervisor that you can do as an employee. Although, if somebody's a bully, because it's another whole part of my practice, I've done the sexual harassment prevention, anti-bullying, anti-gender identification training for a long time, and I do a lot of investigations. I just finished my first international harassment investigation, which was very interesting, talking to different people from different cultures. So if somebody is really being a bully, there are, at least in the United States of California, as I'm fond of saying, there are ways of dealing with it. So you can also, I would say talk to HR, but not all HR people are created equally. But you do have that avenue if you really feel like you're being bullied.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Laura. She found the discussion of millennials and Gen Xers to be interesting.
Probably because she has them, right?
Maybe so.
Yeah.
So those that she's worked with, they act like they know everything and have very little to learn. So it takes a different kind of strategy to work with colleagues from those generations. Do you have any? Have you found that in your consulting? And I'll just build on that. How about tips?
Yes. And I think what's really important, and I'm smiling a little bit because it's happened to me recently, I think it's important to say, gee, that's really interesting. Tell me more. I'm not sure I understand where you're coming from. And it's kind of that gentle approach when Mary was talking about giving the book to somebody, is to say, well, have you thought about it this way? Or have you thought about it that way? Or, that sounds interesting. I think the old... even something I rebelled against, to ask somebody why they do something, quote, we've always done it that way. To me, it doesn't matter if you've always done it that way unless it's been successful. So I think it's diving a little bit deeper and trying to get, in a gentle way, get more acts and facts. Oh, tell me about that. Oh, I find that interesting. I'm not sure I would have considered that before. Now, how about this? Kind of engaging in a conversation where both sides have an opportunity to speak. But that is a hallmark of a millennial, by the way, Lori.
All right, we have another question. I just love this. I don't know who it's from, but what advice would you give to an aspiring writer and artist? I'm a 20-year-old college junior studying animation and writing. I'm aspiring to somehow combine my writing with my visual art. Okay,
this is Griggs now. I'm sorry. For me, I will say this. I learned how to write when I was in law school. I didn't really know how to write before then. For an aspiring writer, I would just say start doing it. Just start writing and write a lot. Put it away, pull it out, look at it, edit it, ask other people to read it, to give you feedback. But there's nothing, I found for me it was a lot more difficult writing the book than I thought it would be because I had it written in my head. But there's nothing that can replace just doing it, just sitting down and doing it. And, Julie and I have had this conversation. One day we did a staycation and I went to her kitchen and wrote, which was getting out of my physical space and all of the demands that happen when I'm in my physical space. So sometimes I think you need to change location. There are writers that are very disciplined who will get up every single day and write between, this hour and that hour, then they do something else. Or I remember reading about Isabel Allende, that she started every book on January 13th of a year. So she kind of gave herself a 2 or 3 week hiatus, and then she would just sit down and write. So I think it's, I found it helpful to have an outline. And that outline changed as I put more words together. But I also found it to be helpful because of this old assuming facts, not in evidence, to put something away and then come back later and read it. And then I've always asked other people to read something and I'd say, tell me what I just said. And if they couldn't repeat to me the point I was trying to make, then I would go back and rewrite it in very plain, simple language.
That's great advice.
Hope that helps.
All right, we just have a couple of minutes left, and I want to make sure that we don't miss out on two quick questions.
Mm-hmm.
I happen to know that you are working on a new book. I don't want you to tell us anything you'd have to kill us over, but what can you share?
Well, I think it came out of, and I mentioned this to Julie in another conversation. I think after having gone through this last election and seeing people say things, and me included, I mean, I will be the first to admit it. I was giving, I was saying not nice things about a lot of people who didn't hold my same beliefs. And I thought, wow, we are really we, including me, are going off the ledge and we're becoming very polarized. So I thought that there were three key points. One of them was, and I kind of answered this a little bit in the question that Lori asked about having those conversations with people, is sitting down with somebody. And in fact, my good friend Gail, who's listening, did this once. We met somebody I knew, she didn't know, that believed something totally different from what I believe and what she believes. And she was listening. And I think it's really important to say, oh, that's interesting. Tell me about it. Why do you think that? What's your experience? And engaging in dialogue. So I think there's one piece about that. There's another piece about the loss of civility. And I just think, in the public square, it's not okay to name call. It's not okay to be a bully, as somebody asked, and it's not okay to cuss at people. And so I kind of go back to acts and facts. I try to be focused on acts and facts. This is my legal training, not conclusions, opinions, or attribution of motivation, and just kind of state what the facts are that lead somebody to an opinion. So having that dialogue. And then third, it's that misuse of the I. I think the word I should be used for accepting responsibility, not for ego. So Julie and I talked about it because in our business, the word courageous seems to be of the moment. So I thought the book could be entitled something like Courageous Communication, A Return to Civility, which would be in a way an oxymoron for some people, but hopefully, I think it takes courage sometimes to listen to others and to lower the temperature and to be engaged and involved, and also to erase from our, from the public square, the cussing and name calling. I mean, I've actually been shocked at some of the stuff I've read on Twitter by the people who've written it, and a lot of them, I'm a political junkie, so a lot of them come from politicians, but it's just. It's mean-spirited, a lot of it, I think, whether you agree with it or not, but it's also disrespectful and degrading. So that's what's going on in my little pea brain now.
Well, I'm excited to see what twists and turns you take this along. Again, we've been talking with Diana Peterson-More about her book, Consequential Communication in Turbulent Times. We just have 1 minute left. So Diana, what one piece of advice might you want to leave everybody with?
I think at the end, it's thinking about the other more than the self. So if I am more concerned about Julie than Diana, hopefully I'm going to show some empathy. Hopefully I'm going to communicate with Julie in the way that she receives information. And hopefully I'm going to talk less and listen more. So I think it's kind of switching that dynamic. And I think Max is supposed to come back too. Where is Max?
I'm right here. So we'll go ahead and end it right there. Thank you everyone so much for joining, for listening to Diana and Julie talk. Diana, Julie, thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation. Again, if you'd like to buy Diana's book, you can go and click that green button down there and it will take you to our website. But with that all out of the way, thank you everyone so much and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.